Hello and welcome to this special. It's a Southland Museum and Art Gallery special. We're focusing on the First World War and in particular the very beginning of the First World War in Southland, the impact of that great conflict on Southlanders and of course society, and what perceptions of that great war were over here back home. With me sitting furthest away is Dr. Aaron Fox. Aaron Fox, welcome. A historian, noted historian.
Thank you very much.
Next to him is Lynley Dear. You're a historian and author of, in fact, Poppy Boys, which I understand is going to be made into a film.
We hope.
Welcome to the show. And
Thank
Michael
you.
Fallow, journalist and historian.
Journalist.
Just journalist? Let's start, if we may. Let's go right back. Of course, we're into the centenary now and the war is underway and armies are manoeuvring through Europe. What is happening? Let's maybe go back a few months, Aaron. What it was happening in Southland prior to the Archduke Ferdinand, of course, being shot by a Serb. I understand it was a Serb, wasn't it?
It was a Serb,
Gavrilo
a Bosnian
Princip.
nationalist.
Bosnian Serb.
Gavrilo Princip,
What was
yeah.
going on? What sort of connection did we have
With what was
at the
happening
other
in
end of the
Europe?
world?
Well, we'd gone through local body elections, to be perfectly honest, at the time, and that was the news of the moment, looking through April, May in the Southland Times for that time.
So the Bluff Borough Council.
On the school trusts, school boards, education boards, so it was all happening. So we were a ferment of political activity in 1914, and our soldiers of the time, because we had conscripted military service at the time, we'd sent a large contingent away to Sutton, near Mataray in Otago, for a military training camp. So we were preparing for a war of sorts. So we had our men in uniform, training into military manoeuvres, but there was really no idea that we'd be sending them off overseas. It was just preparation.
Could we have said they were territorials? Then?
They were
Was that
territorials,
the territorial
yes.
army as Kitchener had dictated that we
Correct.
form?
Yes, this
So-
was the idea of having our civilian standing army in New Zealand. It wouldn't be a permanent force, but we'd actually conscript men of military age, train them up for military service, and they'd be available in the event of a war and could be eligible to serve overseas. It was part of us playing our role in the British Empire. So what we were doing matched what the Australians, the Canadians were all doing in terms of preparing for empire defence.
Do we know how professional those men were? Were
Well,
they
as
weekend
a
warriors?
part of that, in the schools, of course, in the boys' secondary schools, there were the cadets. And that was very military indeed. The boys aspired to wear puttees and were delighted when they were delivered, and they were thrilled to bits when they got the Lee Enfield rifle, which was state of the art. And in the book Poppy Boys, I have one of the Christopher's brothers showing off his Lee Enfield rifle to his younger brother, and in that part of the book he is reminiscing, and he's actually in the theatre of war at that time and realising the irony of that.
And were they weekend warriors? Were these guys, could you say they were highly trained and ready for war at that stage, or was it just a chance for guys to get together as happens now?
Well, somewhere in between.
Yeah.
They did actually were serious about what they were doing. So the military training did have a purpose. We had a small number of professional English officers and NCOs who were sent out to New Zealand to help train the troops, and we were working off the latest manuals of the time.
And they were in Southland?
They were in
operating
Southland as well, yes. Got some of those issued to the local regiment and the local Mounted Rifles regiment, and it's about infantry tactics, mounted rifles tactics, how to operate in the field effectively, how to use your Lee Enfield rifle with the maximum effectiveness and efficiency. So we were being trained in the rudiments of warfare, I'll put it that way. So we had the basic idea of going to war. But in terms of what that meant for a large force on manoeuvre, how you'd operate with other forces, how you'd operate with something bigger than maybe 4,000 or 5,000 men together, we had no concept of the war that was about to erupt involving millions of people.
So the last conflict that New Zealand troops were involved in was the Boer War.
Yes.
And what, Michael, do you know, what did we hear about the Boer War? What sort of media coverage was there? Have you seen what sort of coverage there was?
Oh, the media coverage was limited as what we were fed, and the whole sentiment about the Boer War, regardless of how well it actually went down here, seemed to be very good and very positive. And I think that really did set up expectations for what was to come, and unhappily so, because they were quite unlike what the guys in the World War One were going to face. And when we put up the Boer War Troopers Memorial, it's such a proud thing, and the dullards who put it up actually dropped it and broke it into 3 pieces, but they stitched it back together. So if you have a look at it, it's a very proud kind of monument.
It is.
The guy standing looking nobly down D Street there. And we felt good about it, you know. These guys were called, what, the Rough Riders was the nickname?
Yes, because they were raised by public subscription. In 1900, Otago and Southland raised money to send its troops overseas.
And took their own horses.
Yes, some of their own saddlery as well. They were itching to get into the battle.
So
A soldier who had served in the Boer War and who had been badly injured and had a lot of adventures and had survived actually went and talked to the boys at Southland Boys High School. That's when the school was in Conan Street in a former building, and he told a boy's own story, basically. You know, I found it in one of the old Southlandians, and the young boys would have been, you know, quite blown away by the adventure of this. And then in 1902, Kitchener himself visited, and this is 1902, and so 2 of the 4 Christopher's brothers who were to die in World War One, that's Reginald and Victor, were both at school in 1902, so would have been aware of that.
and he was a superhero, wasn't
And
he?
he
in the
psyched up
colonies
the
or
cadets,
Empire,
of course,
Kitchener.
as well. Yeah, so it was...
It was like having
was
a
all
rock star arrive. Let's put it in a
Totally.
modern context. This guy
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
like a rock star.
Yeah.
There were stories about him
That's
and,
right.
and his adventures
That's right.
in the
Yeah,
colonies.
so you can
certainly in
understand
Africa.
why they were off when...
And that underpins the whole story that
Yeah.
our young people were growing up with about warfare.
Yeah.
It was in the imperial context.
Mm.
Well, it's 100 years, it's 200 years coming up since the Battle of Waterloo. And that was always portrayed as sort of the glorious British victory over the French to settle peace in Europe for another 100 years, as it turned out. We had the South African War experience, more recently Scott of the Antarctic, and the idea of imperial sacrifice and service. I mean, the young people were instilled with this idea that to fight for the empire, to serve for the empire, to die for the empire was actually a glorious thing to do.
So we've got a lot of very enthusiastic young men, is what you're saying. And what about the people around them? What about mothers? What are mothers thinking?
Mothers.
And, you know, as the war's looming, do we have any inclination that there is a war looming?
Yes. In Poppy Boys, I have a scene at the Atautau Sports, and the family have gone out there for the Atautau Sports, and the father, Mr. Christophers, who was quite a stalwart citizen, he was a member of the Invercargill Club and in a bank and so on. And in the scene, which I must admit I have invented, but it could have happened because this is an interpretation, he is sitting under a tree reading the newspaper, and the newspaper is one which I found when I was researching, and it's talking about, he reads out to his wife about the clouds gathering over Europe and all the things that were being said, and it casts a shadow for her, for the mother, over the day.
We do read a lot about that obvious arms build-up with the arms race with the dreadnoughts, of course, with the German Navy and the Royal Navy, ship for ship. And in fact, New Zealanders sponsored, I think, was it HMS New Zealand?
Yes.
Was actually fundraised, wasn't it? So we were actively involved in what was happening. And I guess the expectation was that it would be all over by Christmas, which logistically would have been pretty tough for New Zealanders to get to Europe, finish off the Hun and be back by Christmas.
Not impossible for a New Zealander.
Yeah, well, you know, so, okay, so let's leap ahead because there is a lot to talk about. So the Archduke is assassinated. There's a month of intervening comings and goings in Europe and massive plans that have been in the pipeline for many years, if not decades, are put into action. Men are rolling. What's happening in New Zealand? What's happening in Southland as the armies are converging in Europe?
Well, the war news is being well reported. So the local military units are already starting to warn out their soldiers that they might be required for active service. George Skerritt and Bluff, I mean, he was part of a parade before war was actually declared. That was about this time, 100 years ago, where they're being paraded together and just said, you know, get ready. things are looking grim over in Europe, and we might get involved in this sort of thing, so be prepared.
So how would that message have gone out? Is this in the media? Would it be in printed or...?
The newspaper, I mean, the
Right, word of
Southland
mouth.
Times, Southland Daily News, the Insight, all the local newspapers carried the latest war news. And as it got closer to, in fact, the 4th of August and the declaration of war, they were saying to put out extra editions or put the latest war news in, and a compendium of war news was on the news page. What's the latest? If you haven't got time to read the whole graphic, gory detail of who's starting to confront whom in Europe, what's the gist? So it was well reported right through the region. And I think when I say well reported, effectively reported too. I mean, they're very, very detailed reports trying to explain.
Not jingoistic type reporting?
Well,
it
okay, there is
was-
some jingoistic reporting there. I wouldn't deny that the British Empire is a great thing to be part of, and that when Japan comes into the war on the British side, they talk about, Josh, the brown man of Asia's coming in on the British side. Fancy that. It's not something you'd say today in the newspaper. But
Certainly not.
no, but in the spirit of the times, that's how these
Right.
things are reported. But yeah.
And you've obviously looked at some of these items, have you? And you would agree that you could see that it was accurate reporting of what was happening in Europe?
In the benefit of hindsight, you wouldn't see much there that you would think was desperately wrong, but the attitudes of the day were very much to the fore. And so there was a fairly fierce patriotism that would come out very quickly and very easily. It wasn't all that long before that, just starting the 20th century, where we'd had a display of imperial troops had come down here, and there were Indians, and the Times had reported, we'd trotted along with reporters who looked in the faces of these exotic guys and had found that the Indians, if you looked at them really close, you'd find that there were no traces of debauchery in their features.
Right.
It was all very interesting.
Right.
So that was only, that
Isn't
was
it amazing?
a decade and a half before this. So views were still fairly, perhaps when I'd say stereotypical of the age.
A very different age, though. We're talking the age of the telegram, aren't we? And slow-moving news. Were there actually correspondents embedded, as we are used to now? We get more coverage from embedded correspondents. Where were the reporters? Were they with the armies as they were manoeuvring, or were they reporting from afar, from information being fed to them by High Command?
I think they were so close-ish, but I wouldn't think you'd call it embedded.
Not embedded as we'd understand it today, but embedded in 1914 terms. I mean, the photographs we see in the London Times, excuse me, of photographs taken near the front line by war correspondents. And you do get some dispatches from the front, but of course they're censored fairly closely, fairly early on. I mean, the war news, I think, is retained. The control of that's contained by the British High Command, by the British government. They're quite careful about the sort of information which they release, how and the terms of how the battles are described. What today might be looked as significant reverses in 1914, in the terms of 1914 were described as great victories or
Right,
great
so the
clashes
retreat
of
in
arms.
Mons, the Mons retreat by the British forces, and then the
That was
Marne,
the
of course.
So the retreat from Mons, as you've described, it was the great force of arms at
Right.
Mons, which stops the British,
Right.
stops the German
Right.
army advancing. So it's a great
So a
first British-
reorganisation of resources, not a retreat or even a tactical
a
retreat.
tactical
or
withdrawal.
Right,
Yes.
right.
Don't talk about retreats. It's just we're moving in a rearwards direction.
And so this is all unfolding. The war is declared.
Yes.
What these brothers you've written about, what were they doing? Well, did they enlist en masse? Were they part, as you said, they were part of, they were
No,
militarised before the war?
Reginald had worked in the United States on the railways. He was an engineer, qualified.
So he was in his mid to
And-
late 20s,
yes,
maybe, right?
Yes, that's right. And they did not enlist together, but I can't believe that the enlisting of one wouldn't have influenced the enlisting of another. Another thing too, in 1911, and this has to be borne in mind, there was a notice which was made very plain in all public places that any New Zealand citizen, all New Zealand male citizens between the ages of 14 and 24 had to sign a form to state that they would be prepared to be to be called up. In other words, they would go on what these days we would call a database. If they elected not to sign the form, they were eligible for a fine of £5, an awful lot of money in those days, and they would also not ever in the future be eligible for any job in the public service.
Right.
So that was in 1911 that happened.
And that's the beginning of our
Yeah.
territorial training system, this
Yes.
conscripted service. So
Yeah.
you run forward to this time 100 years ago. The men that the army was wanting to have enlisted for overseas service were the men who had undergone previous military training, were eligible to serve overseas. They wanted them over 21. I think they didn't want them over not over 12 stone in weight and not under 5'4" in height, 5 feet 4 inches in height, unless under exceptional circumstances. So they wanted the single men with military training who were able to volunteer for overseas service. And that's the catchment they're after. But it hasn't happened yet. I mean, the war breaks out on the 4th of August. When we say the war breaks out, Britain declares war on Germany, and it's all on in terms of the British Empire.
And so what happens then? What happens in Southland? Call goes out, assembly points,
Well,
bye mum.
it takes
I'll
a
be back by
day or two
Christmas.
for the news to filter through, because by telegram it doesn't get in the Southland Times till the 6th of August. Because that's a
Slow
daily
news, yeah.
The news is from England to Wellington on the 5th of August. It's proclaimed outside Parliament. Prime Minister Bill
And
Massey.
do we make a declaration?
Yes, we do.
We do.
We make the
It
declaration.
wasn't where Britain goes, we go.
No, it was
Nothing need
basically
to be said.
the war has broken out, we are now part of it. That's rather more the attitude that since Great Britain has declared war, we have offered the services of an expeditionary force to the British Empire, to His Majesty's government, King George V, and Lord Kitchener has gratefully accepted that offer, and having commanded our troops in South Africa, he knows what a fine body of men they are and how well they will equip themselves. That sort of language.
How fine were they, Aaron? I read a lot about how small the English troops were because of the conditions there. Were these New Zealanders big strapping lads from the land? And
You think of the mythology about Gallipoli and the sort of troops we send, the young bronzed athletes who were sort of in their early 20s and 6 foot tall and built like
well
Adonis.
fed on lamb and beef.
Oh, exactly. As it turned out, when the military were going through this compulsory military training, sort of 1912, 1913, they discovered pretty soon that there was a difference between the soldiers they conscripted from urban centres and those from rural areas. The ones from the urban centres tended to be, in a word, scrawny. They were smaller than they expected. They had to make extra small sizes of uniforms to fit them all out. And they were getting worried at the quality of the soldiers they were getting. The men from the farms were a much better calibre of human specimen. So the idea we have of these 6 foot tall soldiers, well, the photograph on the wall behind us is of a selection of Southland soldiers 100 years ago. Fred Rogers is one of them. And you'll see, if you have a look at that photograph, Fred was 6 foot tall, and there are some men there who are about 5'4". And we know some of them in the photographs, and from their files we know their average height is about 5'8", 5'7", 5'8". Their average age is about 25, and they're all single men. And for the infantry units, they're labourers, so they're blue-collar workers.
So you needed really good physical specimens of manhood to shoot to bits at Gallipoli and to slaughter in the mud at Passchendaele.
Well, the best you could offer, but in fact also what we offered up in 1914 were the single men that we could afford to have go overseas. The idea is that without family and they were labourers, without sort of professional careers as such, they were actually free to volunteer and serve overseas. So they were the first we could afford to send out as a community and to let them go, to have them serve overseas.
Well, could we? And I mean, this is a whole other story about the labour that just suddenly disappeared out
Yes.
of Southland.
Well, it's a gradual thing. When you think of 1914, we send away 227 infantry and about 160 mounted rifles with their mounts. So it's a significant number of men, but it's not a huge number that will stop the local economy in its tracks. It's enough people you think, oh, that's a nuisance. Alex Black's no longer working as a mechanic in D Street.
Yes.
But we'll cover. We'll get
Right.
somebody else who can do the job.
And at this stage, what were the media doing? We've seen a few clips. Certainly, there was a bit of inch space given, wasn't there, in the columns as to what was happening in Europe? Was it front page news?
There wasn't front page news, there was front page advertisements. The declaration of war was page 5 news, and if the headline didn't attract your attention, you could turn to the top left hand side of the page where you had a breakdown of the day's news and summary, and it was very balanced. It was, yes, England has declared war. It pretty much went without saying that meant that we were at war. It said that the Southland competition results were to be found in this paper as well. It lamented that there'd been we just lost the footy to Otago 6-3, so it wasn't a good day's news all around. And we were full of reports that had come down. We'd had lots of cable reports coming through about that had developed from, nothing terribly excited at the assassination of the Archduke, but by the time you got down to the deteriorating conditions, then you started to get that the possibility of war is no longer remote tone coming. And when the announcement was made, it was regarded, I think, as not unexpected, but there were conflicting emotions going on in what was written, and half of it was, this really is a very big deal and we need to be really concerned and serious and sober. Let's not get too excited. And on the other side of it, there was, my goodness, this is exciting and thrilling, and here comes adventure. And the two views sort of meshed up together in a very, you could say, self-contradictory way, but it's absolutely the way people were feeling. The paper was encouraging people not to get too het up, and at the same time getting quite het up itself.
Could we say, in Invercargill anyway, papers? Was there an evening paper and a morning paper at that stage?
The Southland Daily News was actually beat the Times to the story because of the way it broke. It broke for the Daily News better. And there was newspaper in Gore. We had several papers going here.
And there was hunger for the information.
Oh, yes,
Newspaper. This is before wireless. This is before anything, isn't it? Really, this is the step between town crier and what we've got now with radio and television, and of course the internet. The newspaper wasn't it? That was your way of getting solid information about something happening further than a few miles from home.
Exactly, and we had a real. We had to accept in many respects what we were given. I mean, the news had come down through cables. It had come down from London to Australia a lot of the time, and then to New Zealand, and there were censorship at play in London, and censorship at play in Australia, and censorship at play in New Zealand. And of those,
so how diluted was that information when it got to the bottom of the empire here? Impossible
somewhat,
to say?
Yeah, very hard to say, I think, yes. I know that amongst the journalists at the time, the reproach, and there was considerable reproach, was at the Australian end of things. There was a view that we could all understand, I think, that there would be censorship. So the media conceptually had no great problem with that. There was a view, I think, that they can handle all that at the London end, and we'll just take what we're given and go from there. So I think there was some displeasure at the thoughts of the Aussies meddling, and they did. And there was some mad inconsistencies. There was a speech by the Australian Governor General that wasn't permitted into New Zealand, for one thing. Now that seemed a bit crook, that they wouldn't actually export that speech. It was their own Governor General.
Right.
There was a greater scandal, I think, if you wanted to call it that, was that the results of the Caulfield Cup were delayed. I don't think they were actually censored. I think it might have actually been a logjam caused by the censor casting his eye over it, and there was real grizzling that the Aussie censor was sitting on things. These are military men. That was perhaps sitting on things and releasing them in batches at his own leisure, and to coordinate less with the imperatives of news deadlines in his own meal times and things like that. But when the Caulfield Cup was delayed, that went down very badly. And there had been some sneering too, that the likes of a statement from the Bank of England was waste-binned because there was concern that the code, there might be in all the figures, there might be some subtle code that was communicating information from the Bank of England to the enemy somehow. So
when we talk about the media, there was a period in the 20th century, of course, where a lot of the media was state-run. What are we, broadcast media in particular, but that era, these are independently run newspapers, aren't they?
Yes, well certainly the Southland Times was independent. It was family owned at that stage by the Gilmores. And R.J. Gilmore, who was the son of Robert Gilmore, who had really built up the paper very well. And his son was, like his dad, as much a newsman as he was a businessman.
Right.
And everything that the Southland Times was doing then very much bore his stamp in terms of a degree of caution, but quite forthright too. The Times had picked big fights with the government previously when it wanted to, but it accepted the idea of censorship. It just joined the general chorus of lament about how inept it was proven.
And in your view, and we're going to take a break soon, but in your view, was there bias at all, that the media wasn't self-serving at that stage? Was it, looking at it now with the information we have in hindsight, how accurate was that reporting? Was there possibly any sort of agenda at all? I'm only speculating, but was the media telling it as it was?
I think it's a very subjective call there. I think that there was a degree of self-censorship that was going on. I think not so much within the newspaper itself as within the whole community. You wouldn't read a lot in the Southland Times, for instance, in terms of should we go to war. There was no great pause to consider that, really. It was pretty much a given. But now, whether that was the Southland Times imposing its will on the community, I would suggest that it wasn't. I think it was that same question wasn't particularly being asked in the community either. It was a step that didn't seem to present itself as we were at war. And who were we? Well, we were part of the empire. Thank you very much. We knew that.
We'll leave it right there. We're going to take a quick break in the Southland Museum and Art Gallery World War I or Great War special. We're talking about the lead up, and we'll get into the fact, the departure of the troops and where they actually went and what knowledge they had about where they were going, in fact, and back home on the home front, what was happening there. We'll look forward to your company real soon. Cheers. And welcome back to our First World War special, the Southland Museum and Art Gallery special. We're talking about the very early stages of the war and the impact on Southlanders. Now we're going to talk about, the enlistment, I guess, of these gentlemen. Dr. Fox, let's start with you. What was happening? Okay, so these guys are rushing. Were they rushing to sign up for this great adventure?
Well, they certainly did. I mean, the message goes out for some of the regiments to parade. This is about the offers, I think, of the expeditionary forces accepted on about the 7th.
So some of these guys would have travelled from a long way, you know,
well,
this is
they're
a big
locals.
region, isn't
they're
it?
Southlanders. So when you're talking about the military area of Southland in 1914, it's west of the Mataura River. So it's the old provincial area of Southland, essentially. So and the east of that were the South Otago regiments. So each military district, that's Auckland, Canterbury, Wellington, Otago, contributed 4 regiments or 4 infantry units and 3 or 4 mounted rifles units. We contributed 1 infantry unit, 1 mounted rifles unit. So when the balloon goes up in 1914, when war's declared, our mounted rifles unit and our infantry unit are essentially called up, and the men are given the opportunity to volunteer for active service. They have to volunteer and agree to go overseas. That's one thing. They can't just be sent overseas. They have to agree to do it. They come into Invercargill, they go through a medical examination, and then from that medical examination the list is chosen as to who fits the requirements for overseas service.
What made you ineligible?
Too short, too tall,
Flat feet?
Poor eyesight, have you suffered fits before? That will disbar you from military service, and condition of teeth. Because when they were looking through the men, a lot of them had false teeth and bad upper teeth, so dental work was required in some cases before they could go overseas. And Fred Rogers told the story of one gentleman who was beneath 5'4". He was too short. He was turned down, so his mates took him down to the rowing club and strapped weights to his feet and stretched them. And he came back and he stretched just enough. That effect will last a few days. It worked, and he survived the war too.
And we read a lot about boy soldiers. Were there young men that lied about their age?
Well, they tried to, but look, in a community like Southland,
Everyone
you know
knows
everybody,
everyone.
and they're already in the military units, and the defence, the cadre NCOs know the men, and they know the sort of people they want to hear.
Right, so there were no 16-year-olds certainly sent away in that first.
I can't argue that. I can't say for sure that there weren't some who were upping their age or lowering their age at the other end to get away, but I'd say that happens a bit later in the war.
I can tell a story, excuse
That's
me,
right.
Aaron, of a young man, a Southland Boys High School pupil. He was from Bluff, Alan Salamanson, you might know the story. And he was a young man, he was sort of strapping and really big for his age. And on a fateful day, he was seen walking around the street, and a woman presented him with a white feather. And as he had just turned 17, and as a result of that, he went to enlist, lied about his age, and was killed at Passchendaele on October the 12th. Yeah,
1917.
1917.
So that sort of reflects a bit little later in the
The
war, doesn't it?
worst day of
And
Passchendaele.
so we hear about that white feather, and I
Yeah.
actually sort of dismissed it when I was younger, that maybe it was a few isolated cases, but it really did happen.
No,
didn't
his
it? It did.
family came to see me. They had been to visit the school and noticed that his name was incorrectly spelt, and got in touch and told me that story.
And did he see much of the war, or was
He lived until October the 12th,
right? So
1917.
he's a 1914
Which was-
enlistee.
I'm not 100% certain
Right.
when he enlisted. Do you know that, Aaron? Do you know anything about
I
him?
have to check on that. A little
Yeah.
later on, I believe.
Right. Any time on the Western Front would have been
Yeah.
enough, really. Though.
Well, of
Pretty
course, the
much.
people who survived Gallipoli only survived it to be killed on the
Put into the
Somme
meat
or
grinder.
Passchendaele.
Okay, so we've got men enlisting.
Training at the drill hall. They were
At the
there
drill hall.
because
Where
they
were they
medically
staying in
accepted.
the city? Was there a tent city
They
somewhere?
were
or-
down at the showgrounds.
Right.
So there was a tent city there. The horses were being congregated there because you had men being enlisted.
And
You
so
had
were the horses.
horses being enlisted as well.
Yeah.
The mounted would bring their own horses with them, and they could be accepted into military service, and then the men would be paid out on the value of the horse. And separately, there were army personnel going around the region recruiting horses for artillery service.
Was it the case that not all horses were acceptable?
Correct. There were certain types of horses which were acceptable, but
What made an unacceptable horse? Very much
The
like
colour,
a human, I guess.
dun,
Height, weight,
no, it was the breed.
hooves.
There were certain breeds that
Right.
they wouldn't take. Chestnuts were one, I think, from memory. Greys and duns were types of horses that were not acceptable for military service. Others would be considered. And I think they wanted heavy sort of Clydesdale type. They wanted the heavier
Right.
sort of horses who could take the weight and pull the guns.
Because we don't think about that a lot, do we? There were a lot of horses committed, not only in the First but the Second World War as well, but we're
Correct.
looking at the First now, and there were a lot of horses taken from here and Australia
Correct.
and many other parts of the Empire as well.
Quite a few die on the way overseas. You read the war diary for 1914 and the Expeditionary Force talks about the number of horses per week that have had staggers or died and had to be tipped over the side for one reason or another. And the irony is, of course, that the horses make it as far as Egypt, where the hot conditions are far too rough for them, and they can't get them the right sort of feed. They have to feed them on the local feed, local Egyptian
Insufficient.
feeds. Well, they do adapt, but it takes a while, and the horses have to have they have to be clipped and shaved.
And an
So-
army can't be mobile without its main tool of mobility, can it?
Correct, but the main tool of mobility in 1914
legs.
is the army boot and the foot soldier, and you march. And that's one thing they were capable of doing, marching a long way.
And
after
so,
training.
so we've got all these young men assembled in Invercargill, no doubt. I mean, the Invercargill nightlife probably enhanced for that wee brief period that they were here.
You'd like to
Money
think
was
so, but
spent.
in
There would have
fact-
been a little bit of an economic boom.
Let's think more of a carnival atmosphere at the
Right.
AMP showgrounds. It
Right.
really was like a gigantic
And-
carnival or a
right.
jamboree.
And so you've got families in and out visiting men.
You also got the local women knitting like crazy, knitting
Right,
socks, knitting
right.
comforters, knitting mittens. because
Mittens
they're
for
obviously
victory sort of thing.
Exactly. You know, they're heading into summer overseas, but nobody's thought about it because they're coming in anyway. It's getting into winter. The poor men must need socks, and there's one thing the men at Gallipoli always had: an abundant supply of socks. No, they were short of everything
sure
else,
they
but they
found
always had
uses for them.
exactly right. Yeah. But so there's that patriotic fervour going on. There's fundraising, and again, it's like a telethon. The number of people who are in the paper saying, we have donated X number of pounds to
Right.
the war effort. We're going to help equip someone with a horse or
Right.
whatever,
Yep.
whatever. So,
And how was the paper covering what was happening with all these young men converging on Invercargill ready to depart? Was there any special coverage for it, as an event like that today would gather or garner?
Yes, there was all sorts of coverage, and not a lot you would think happened without it making its way into the Times. And people wanted to do something practical if they could. And there were certainly appeals for money was the main thing, but we had some wonderful lists of, especially contrasting lists of what people would come up with. And you have, in the same list we had, I think, the Southland Bank donating, it might have been £500 to it, and that was fine. You go down the list and there were sort of stock and station agents donating, companies donating £100, and we go down and you'd go down a few inches and you'd find donations of £5. Go down a bit further, you'd find donations of horses. And the lovely one at the bottom that I always thought was wonderful was Kingsland's Biscuit Factory donated 1 tonne of biscuits.
And there was obviously there was an aspect of, there was patriotism there, but there was self-promotion as well. They made it to the paper and their brand was there saying we're giving this to that great cause.
I think you probably would have been noticed if you weren't on the list sooner or later. So I don't know how much direct pressure there was. I suspect there was some, you'd have to. But certainly after a while, I think those whose name hadn't been in the Southland Times columns donating some damn thing would have been started to feel a bit vulnerable on that basis.
And actually it would have been interesting to see what police activity there was over that period too, because these guys, being young men coming together, there would have been a certain element of
well, they were innocent
a group
men
of young
in those
men
days.
coming together.
They were innocent men. I mean, wait till you get them to Cairo. Now that's when they can start to kick up their heels a bit. They're away from home. But here, with the eyes of the community upon them, in uniform,
well behaved,
under command, and probably in a guarded situation down at the showgrounds.
And so where to from there then?
Well, I think a couple of curious aspects is that the local Maori join up with their mates in the infantry units. That we don't get a great number going off to the specific native contingent that's being formed, the Pioneer Battalion. Also, people of German descent, but who had been resident here in New Zealand and were British citizens, joined up.
Resident or born here?
British
So
nationals.
they could well have been born
here,
Germany.
Practically born in New Zealand, or some German nationals who have.
And how many of them would there have been?
Well, you look through the list. We had an Orsweiler, we had a Metzger, we had a Schwartlager later on. So we had people of definite German descent, but joining up with the local forces, with their mates, heading off overseas. Now, as far as they knew, they were heading off to France to fight the Germans. So it's a slightly risky business.
As far as everyone knew, that was the plan, wasn't it?
Yes.
So let's talk about all that coming together, the enlistment process. Then we're moving on. Where to? Where were they headed?
They first lot entrain on the 17th of August here in Invercargill, and they head away to Dunedin. Now that's a concentration area for Otago and Southland. In the background is the idea that the New Zealand government is making up its expeditionary force. It's about a brigade strength, about 8,000 troops, to send overseas to help the British war effort. Now, they're trying to get enough transports to put the men and horses in, and enough naval escorts to help guide the expeditionary force to join up with the Australians and make it overseas. That's taking time. We had thought that by the end of August, the expeditionary force would head away with it. It doesn't go till October. So in the meantime, the concentration area is in Dunedin for all the Otago Southland troops, and they come together there, train there some more, and in September they head off from Port Chalmers up to Wellington, where the whole expeditionary force is concentrated. That's Auckland, Wellington, Canterbury, Otago troops, and then they finally head off overseas.
Well,
so it's a staged process.
You mentioned training there. Are we talking about live fire training, or are we talking about parade ground training?
Musketry training, bayonet drill, even basics of getting their kit together and getting the comfort parcels that they're going to need. So it's a bit of everything. It's getting into the rigours of military life, and also sorting out who within your various units are going to be your sergeants, your corporals, your NCOs, making sure that you've got a full complement of men, you've got all the equipment you need, they know how to use it, and they're comfortable in it. And again, the photograph just behind us is taken in September 1914, where some of our Southland troops are fully equipped and armed, under training, and they're starting to look like an effective military unit. I mean, the men behind me in the photograph are starting to look as though they know their business.
You're bringing this photo to life for me, actually, and this is one of the problems with the Great War, is that people that I'm talking to feel distant from it, not only because it's a century ago, but because we see these grainy black and white sepia tone photos and you don't identify with them. But now you're injecting life into these young men, certainly for me.
Thank you. We can look at the photographs.
It makes a huge difference.
Each of them have their own stories. I mean, one of the gentlemen there, he's third from my right is Fred Rogers, the only New Zealand veteran to return to Gallipoli 75 years later. Beside him, the sergeant we know is killed in May 1915. He's from Winton. And also in the photograph is Alec Black, who I mentioned earlier, the first Southland to die at Gallipoli on the 25th of April 1915. So we've got a representative sample here of Southland and Winton soldiers.
How important do you think it is? Well, let's leave the story. The troops are heading to Wellington to head over abroad.
Yes.
How important is it that we keep these stories, that we know this, that these are documented?
We have the myth of Gallipoli about New Zealand nationalism born on the beaches, and we send all these men away, and we have this idea of these young, carefree, bronzed, fit men from communities that really we couldn't identify with. Whereas in fact, when you take the profile of men who do leave, they are our community of 1914. We could find those people today. We've similar profile of our labour force. People in their 20s, people doing blue-collar work, people who haven't married yet. These guys were still living at home. They're like advanced teenagers, if you like, with their first job. The thing is that these people are living, breathing representatives of Southland 100 years ago, and what they experience at Gallipoli is something that we can't even begin to come to terms with. So it's actually recognising that Gallipoli was a very human experience, and that it represented real people, not just myths and not just names on a cenotaph or grainy photographs in a book. They were real people we can actually identify with.
Aaron, to pick you up on the living and breathing and the not just names, the reason I wrote the book Poppy Boys, this came about because in researching for the Southland Boys High School Museum, because my family are sons, and I read all of these names, and there are names on both the memorials in the school hall. They're just names in bronze in the school hall, admittedly, but just names. And I began to wonder, it became obvious that, there was a young man behind that name. And so that was the reason why I researched every one of them. And so each one has a biography, and so they are now commemorated that way every year in the Boys High Anzac ceremony. And that is, of course, how I found out about how many brothers were killed and all that sort of thing. And Aaron says living and breathing, which is what he's doing now with all of this. And it's exactly the same thing, because they were real people. The biographies were of necessity very brief, most of them very brief. What they did at school, what they did in the short careers that they had, what sports they were good at. A few of them had university degrees and so on, but they're all there. And that is what I think is so important, isn't it, Aaron? Because we're 100 years out, they have to be real. Otherwise, it's the risk that they're just memorials.
Michael, what sort of records are there at the Southland Times on those men, personal stories? Were prominent members of the community that went, or obituaries of those men perhaps longer than your average farm labourer, or did the paper cover them like that? Was there a hierarchy, if you like, of societal significance?
I'd like to think not so much. Rather than obituaries, I think the real humanity of it came through. Firstly, it simply came through in the lists of the dead, and you could be getting sanitised an account, if you like, of from officialdom, but the death ranks were coming through in big black bordered columns, and those names people knew these people, knew their sons.
And where were they in the paper?
Death notices, the lists of the raw dead, each with a wee thing, you know.
And so was that back of the paper? Was that on the front page? Or?
Neither really, in the middle.
Right.
But they, the accounts, the war reporting improved in some respects because everyone got better at it. And down here in Southland, the journalists got better, especially Gilmore himself got better at interpreting the silences. And we've had accounts of, the reports we've received from the cables today are to expect no events of any great significance, which surely means that something's up, reports the Southland Times, because we're starting to interpret silences. And we become more critical of the information that we were getting. At the same time, people were coming home. People who'd been injured were arriving back, and I think especially the letters started coming back. And some parts of me that isn't a journalist thinks I have some sympathy for someone who might write a letter home to his parents, and then the proud mum or dad shows up in the Southland Times and says, "We've received a letter from the front." And we seized upon these, and we printed those, and this was real citizen journalism. Right. And they had been censored a wee bit themselves sometimes, but I think if you
by
read
their
them,
commanding officers, or by when they arrived in New Zealand,
I assume so.
Yep.
They're certainly at that end, and but they still contained vivid and very moving accounts of what had happened, and many times they were just better reads than what you were getting from the war correspondents that were out there, or roughly at the same place. These were the people who'd been reporting back home from in the thick of it. They weren't up to date, of course, and that's why the Southland Times towards the end of the war, it's a hard one for researchers, because if he wants to know what really happened and to get the paper's perspective of it, you're often not quite as well served going to immediately after it as to just waiting a bit and just keeping your patience and following through, because eventually the letters from the soldiers would start coming through. The paper printed a lot of them. Right. And they were great reads, and these guys, it turns out, could write, and they understated, but that just made them more moving. They would never say, I lay there in agony. They would, they're writing home to their mum, so they're going to say, that they would describe in very muted and carefully worded terms, sanitised, but not so well as that you couldn't see what they were being careful not to disclose. And that just made it more powerful to read.
They also wrote to the rector of their old school.
Right.
Imagine that.
Right.
And there's some postcards here, Hunter, and beautifully embroidered, which they tended to buy in France in camp. But more than one of those contains the word, "I'm still alive and well." And in a couple of cases, I know that didn't continue.
Yes, that's right.
To be the case.
People were receiving letters, and we're jumping here. We do want to get to the departure for Egypt, and that's something before we go shortly. But, mothers would be receiving letters after they'd got a telegram informing them that a son was killed in action.
Right. Well, the two Mackenzie brothers were killed on the same day. And
devastating. It is our own Private Ryan, isn't it, really, that scenario?
Yes, that's true.
Okay, we've got the troops in Wellington. Where to from there?
Departure in October for the Great Adventure. So they're seen off from Wellington.
They still thought they were off to France?
They still thought they were off to France, because Turkey is just coming into the war by then. We didn't even know Turkey was in the war, but it comes in because of the British, I guess.
Very late they aligned with Germany.
Well, they did, and that's due in part to British mismanagement of their side of things. I mean, if the Turks have spent a lot of time raising public money for two of their warships, and the British happened to seize those warships under construction in England.
I think the Turkish crews were even there, ready to take possession, weren't
they? The British said, well, actually, you can't have that now, we're going to use it. And that was Turkish national pride at stake. And then the British go and bombard the
These were dreadnoughts or cruisers?
They were cruisers, I think. The thing with England is, and Germany as well, when you're making weaponry for potential allies or enemies, you never give them anything better than you've got yourself. It's always slightly lesser, just to give your own forces the advantage.
Makes sense.
It does. So Germany. Turkey has come into the war in October, declared a jihad, incidentally, and our troops are still heading off to England to get ready to fight in France in 1915. They're going to go to England, be offloaded in southern England, train, harden up for warfare, and head off to the front line when the campaigning season renews in the European spring. But the conditions in England are so bad that winter, the Canadian forces who have just arrived have so much sickness, the decision is made instead to take our Australian and New Zealand expeditionary forces to Egypt and offload them there, where they can harden up in the Egyptian sun. Egypt's a British protectorate by now, so they can harden up in a safe area and then be taken to France.
So what month are we talking here?
They arrive
probably November,
December,
right.
late
Before
in
the shelling of the Dardanelles.
About the time the very first shelling of the Dardanelles takes place, and the Turks really get annoyed at that point and close the Narrows to any shipping. They're not actively in the war by then, but the British start to just tickle them up a little and say, well, if you're in the war, fine, this is a taste of what it's going to be like. So the expeditionary forces, Australia and New Zealand, sitting in Egypt, readying themselves for the campaign.
Having quite a good time, by all
Quite a
accounts.
good time, yes, Cairo, and the official history of New Zealand at Gallipoli makes no bones about the fact that the New Zealand men, young single men in their prime, enjoyed everything that Cairo had to offer, from the Harat al-Wazir, which is the red light area, through to some very exotic food experiences.
And we received those the first casualties of venereal diseases, really. I know
yes.
our men had been to Samoa, the 5th Wellington had been in Samoa,
Correct.
and there was no hostilities there, was there?
In Samoa we seized the first one of the German
without
possessions.
shots being
Without
fired,
a shot
I think.
being fired.
Okay, so our first casualties were venereal disease in Italy and...
So in Egypt, our first
in Egypt, sorry, yes,
self-inflicted
in Egypt.
wounds. My
Self-inflicted
grandfather was one of them,
wounds,
I have
right.
to confess. And he was sent back under armed guard. He'd got
Right.
a very unpleasant
That's right.
version of venereal disease. So a number
Right.
of them were sent back, so it wouldn't the infection would be contained and treated. But our first combat casualty was in 1915 when the Turks attacked the Suez Canal, and Private Ham from
Right,
Nelson was
that's
killed
right.
during that fight.
And we
February.
acquitted ourselves quite well there, though, didn't we?
We
the New
acquitted
Zealanders?
ourselves well, but the trouble was that the Turks had crossed the Sinai Desert, which is an amazing feat of arms by itself, bringing their little boats with them to cross the Suez Canal. By the time they got to the canal, they were a weakened force and fairly low morale.
A bit of a, excuse the pun, turkey shoot.
It was a
I've
bit of a
read.
turkey shoot, you're right. And the first combat with Turkish troops, they were no enemy at all, and the poor devils lay wounded and dying in these pontoons that they carried with them, and died under the Egyptian sun as the New Zealanders were watching. And they didn't think much of the Turks as an enemy. So when finally the decision was made to send the forces to Gallipoli on the
And
25th of April,
Right. So what month are we talking when that decision
February
made?
was the attack on the Suez Canal. March is the failed British naval attack on the Dardanelles, and between March and April the decision is then made to put a ground force onto Gallipoli and seize the forts, seize the Narrows.
And what do you know, the New Zealand and Australians are conveniently sitting not too far away.
Exactly. Now they're an untried force, they're a colonial force, they're not as good as the British Army fighting in France, but they're an available force. So they're handed over to Ian Hamilton, who had come to New Zealand in 1914 and inspected the New Zealand troops. He'd seen our Otago Southland boys at Mataray Camp in 1914 and thought them a good lot. And with a bit of training and a bit of self-discipline, they might make decent soldiers. He's the general who takes us to Gallipoli on the 25th of April.
And so, even on embarking towards the Dardanelles, the New Zealand troops had no idea, did they,
Well, I don't
where
think
they were off to?
anybody had heard of the Dardanelles. And
Were they training with landing craft, or well, not landing craft? They're actually large,
They're rowed
almost whaling boats.
They're
aren't they?
rowed ashore in whaling boats,
Right, so they
there's a
had
little
been
bit of
training.
training. Actually, the combat loading of the ships is a big one. If they're taken over to Lemnos, everything's unloaded off the ships and then backloaded so that you have the ammunition at the top where you need it, not at the bottom where you can't get to it when you're fighting. And for all the training they had, the very basic maps of Gallipoli. Some of the officers had a very basic battle plan, and as far as they knew, they were going to land at Gabatipi on the 25th of April, thinly held part of the Gallipoli Peninsula, and they were going to advance rapidly inland behind the Australians and cut the Turks off, and war done. An amazing, decisive, tactical attack which would knock Turkey out of the war and bring Greece and Bulgaria in on the Allied side.
Back home shortly after Christmas then, was
Pretty
the
much.
perception at that stage.
Yes, well, I mean, the Germans had kept fighting in France. They hadn't done the decent thing and surrendered, so the battle lines were being drawn in France. This was, from the English point of view, when looking at the Gallipoli and the chance to knock Turkey out of the war, it was another way of bringing the war to a rapid conclusion.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time at this stage. We've covered the initial periods of the declaration of war and a little prior to the war breaking out. We will, as the centenary rolls out, be hopefully revealing more about the Southland contingent and perceptions at home of the impact of Southlanders and the New Zealand contingent as a whole on firstly Gallipoli and then the Western Front. I'd like to thank my panel. Thank you very much for coming along. It's been most enlightening and it certainly made me think more about the Southland contingent, not just the New Zealand contingent as a whole. Thank you very much for tuning in to this Southland Museum and Art Gallery special. I hope that's been thought-provoking for you as well. We'll look forward to your company again. Thank you.